We will now move on to our discussion for the day. This one I've been eagerly anticipating. This is going to be fun. So we're going to finish it off. And this segment and this luncheon today is sponsored by SpaceX. So let's hear something from them.
Dragon, SpaceX, contract ground stations.
Inspiration forward, go for launch. Sponsored SpaceX.
Welcome aboard, Dragon.
The largest window ever flown in space.
With the entire AX-1 crew now on board.
3, 2, 1, 0.
We have liftoff.
Vehicle supersonic.
Systems remain go for the flight of Starship 15. We have ignition. We are down. The Starship has landed. An outstanding period as we work to enable the future of human spaceflight.
All right. Wasn't sure when that was going to end. But it's like science fiction every time I see it. Always very cool. All right. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. So to introduce our speakers today, I'd like to welcome up from SpaceX, Nick Cummings, Senior Director of Government Systems and Advanced Development. Nick.
All right, I have the pleasure of introducing Alex MacDonald, who's going to be talking to Carissa Christensen today. I've known Alex for a really long time. So when Alex joined NASA headquarters from Ames as the chief economist when I was in the Senate. And there was a lot of people saying, NASA, what, chief economist at NASA? What does NASA need a chief economist for? Well, really, I mean, a lot. NASA probably needed a chief economist a lot earlier. But Alex has done a lot more than that. He's a connector. If you're familiar with the concept from Malcolm Gladwell's novels of about innovation and how that comes about, like one of the most important types of person that you need in an innovation ecosystem are these people who are connectors because of what they know and who they know and the diversity of who they know and talk to and the relationships that they make, and that's Alex. But he's also one of NASA's, I think, best big thinkers. And I think he demonstrated that in something that I think he'll be known for a long time. And frankly, a lot of you guys may not know is that Alex was the one who actually conceived of the Artemis. I guess branding is maybe the best way to say it, although that doesn't really do it justice, because the concept of Artemis is really more about the narrative of a return to the moon that everybody in the United States could see themselves in. So I think our space program is most powerful when the people of the United States, no matter what their background is, can all see themselves in the space program. And that narrative has sustained Artemis, and I think will sustain it. It has brought together companies who don't normally work together. It has brought together Republicans and Democrats, and it has survived, an administration change, and it will survive more. And so I am really proud of the direction that NASA is going. Returning the first, we are very proud to be part of the bigger Artemis effort, landing the first woman on the surface of the moon and the first person of color and the first of many. And really proud to be a part of an Artemis program that is bringing all of the diversity that the United States has to offer, and will make us an even more powerful space power, I guess, moving forward into the next many years. So Alex, appreciate you, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
That was incredibly kind, Nick. Thank you.
Oh, what a pleasure it is to be here this afternoon with you all, and to have the opportunity to talk to Dr. Alex MacDonald, NASA's chief economist. And I think Nick hit the nail on the head with the question, what is the chief economist, NASA? And so I thought it would be really interesting to talk this afternoon about what that means, why it's important, and what has transpired as a result of or through that role. I'm Carissa Christensen, the CEO of BryceTech. I met Alex quite some time ago when he was just entering the arena as someone who has spent much of my career advocating for more disciplined and serious treatment of issues like economic trends and market dynamics in our community. I was delighted to see Alice. I think I surprised you a little bit with my enthusiasm for your entrance into the community. So I'm going to grill you today about what you do. So let's cast our minds back to 2008, where I'm sure we met in a sober conference room and not in a bar in Las Cruces. At one of those conferences, and talk a little bit about, at that point in 2008, what was the thinking at NASA behind the value of having an economist in a leadership role?
Well, thank you, Carissa, and thanks to Jim and the whole team for organizing this event. It's a real honor, actually, to be here with you all. To be clear, I was not hired into a leadership role. I was hired in as a contractor to work on cost modeling, because there are, in fact, many economists at NASA. We have a lot of economists in our budget division. Perhaps one of the most important roles that economists or people who at least engage with economics at the agency have had has been in cost modeling. We could go into depth about the different types of cost models and parametric versus grassroots and grounds up, but you would fall asleep into your lunch. But that was how I started. I was hired into the NASA Ames Mission Design Center, where we were working on innovative small satellite solutions with this crazy idea that people had at the time that you could build useful satellites for less than a few $1 million. In 2008, that was still a pretty heretical idea. And in fact, one of the biggest challenges was convincing people that the cost models, in fact, that were parametrically telling you that they had to cost hundreds of millions were wrong because technology had changed. But the real reason that I got brought in was really because Pete Warden, who was the center director at NASA Ames, was familiar with some of the research I was doing on the long run economic history of space exploration. And this was what my doctoral dissertation was. And it was really about who funded all of the astronomical observatories in the 19th century and early 20th century. So when you start the history of American space exploration with the Cold War space race, it looks like there is a narrative that says the government comes in and we create space programs in the military and at NASA, and that is how we went into space. But after seeing the flight of Spaceship One, which was for me a pretty transformative event, I started looking to say, hey, how long have we as individuals been spending our own money on space exploration? And when you look at that question and follow it through, you will find that in the 19th century, the vast majority of all the telescopes in this country, the most expensive ones, the billion-dollar class ones of Lick Observatory, Mount Palomar Observatory, Mount Wilson Observatory, and the smaller community-funded ones like the Cincinnati Observatory and the Albany Observatory, 98% of all the funding for it came from private individuals. And that was interesting because this funding was not trivial. This was billions of dollars when you add it all up. And so there was the thinking, because NASA Ames is in Silicon Valley, where there was a lot of high net worth individuals. And there was some thinking that said, hey, how can we unlock some of this private capital to help us do more in space? Robert Lightfoot, who's of course now at Lockheed, but used to be our associate administrator at NASA, always had one of my favorite lines, which is that NASA is 15 pounds of program in a 5-pound bag. And the amount of pounds that we keep trying to fit into that bag seems to only increase every year. And the only way to increase that bag a little bit is to get more capital onto the table from private individuals. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how we get that into the door. And the major, kind of first leadership opportunity that I got was running something called the Emerging Space Office, which was something that was set up in budgets in the 2011 timeframe. Again, this was only 1 year after the COTS Demo 1 flight. This is real early days. And in the budget, there was the idea of having an office that was dedicated to encouraging commercial space activities. I, however, because that word was somewhat of a lightning rod of the day, said, actually, no, the goal is to do economic analysis. The goal is to recognize that we're entering into a new era of space exploration, a new emerging space era, where new capabilities, everything from private companies to crowdfunding to individual space tourism, is part of NASA's future too. And so set up that office, and that's where you and I got to work together a lot. And yeah, that's how it started.
And so your work, your PhD thesis and that work, I think has really become part of the narrative of the industry. In the last week, I've been at, I think this is my third conference in the last 10 days. And I've twice heard people just sort of talk about that, the private sector investment over a long history. One person cited you, the other, I think more powerfully didn't, was just sort of reporting the reality of the community. I think you've really shaped that discussion. So moving to the role of chief economist and thinking about how your role at NASA has evolved, I will say, I think that, we've been a little flip about the question of why does NASA need to teach technologists. In my view, I agree very strongly with Nick. There's absolutely no question that role is critical. And certainly what that role involves has changed over the last, probably since 2015 is kind of the point of demarcation I use for really moving into a new realm. So how's that evolved?
Well, so this week is a big week in the world of NASA economics. We released our economic impact report, which we do every 2 years. And the agency had never actually done it at an agency level because it's actually a lot of work. It actually involves every CFO office at every center to track where every dollar is spent by zip code, to send all that information off to the group at University Illinois Chicago, who runs a very standard Leontief input-output model for determining economic impact. And we did our one that just released yesterday. The agency's kind of baseline estimated economic impact on the American economy is about $71 billion with over 339,000 jobs supported. That is a major economic impact. And as Administrator Nelson mentioned yesterday on CNBC, that is really actually a minimum way of thinking about it, because that does not include the technology transfer, does not include the way that NASA has been a catalyst in the economy for the commercial space sector overall, and it doesn't include the value of climate change data that is provided as well. So that was one of the roles, but to be honest, the thing that I think is most important to have economic thinking at agency, at the agency is for program formulation and for program creation. One of the things that's been very exciting the last few years is we have created more new programs at NASA than I think we have in quite a long time. Just listing the lunar ones alone, Gateway, HLS, the Gateway Logistics contracts, CLIPS, and of course, the LSII, and then of course, all of the pieces of that. Those were all effectively created as real new things in the last 5 years. Yeah.
And there's a due diligence role
Right.
associated with that. That's almost about protecting those programs.
Correct. So the agency does a lot of serious business analysis of all of its programs. We were talking at lunch about the need at some point to tell the history of the next step BAA mechanism, because actually that mechanism was created a while back, and we're on to significant numbers of letters through the alphabet. And I remember doing the due diligence, the business due diligence on the next step BAA sans appendix, right? And that is a really important part of it, because there are a lot of claims made about investment, and there's a lot of different types of business models that may or may not work. And the agency has to understand where its dollar is likely to be the critical dollar, where we're hoping that a business model might emerge, but we're okay if it doesn't. Having these types of conversations internally with the agency that frankly may not be the same conversations that we have publicly. That is a really important function that happens inside the agency that we have been honing, and there's a lot of others involved with that too. I'm by far not the only economist who gets involved in this due diligence of the agency, but it's been a new type of capability that we've built in.
How does the chief economist fit into the agency broadly, into that broader conversation? You talked about program formulation.
Sure.
Are there other elements of that conversation that you think are important?
I mean, certainly, always our relationship with the White House. So I sit in the office of the administrator. So I've been in the same office since the end of the Obama administration. That role then was the senior economic advisor, was not the chief economist role. But it's been the same function. And there's a lot of back and forth with the White House about program formulation, about priorities. Right now, for example, sitting on a OSTP working group on natural capital accounting and ecosystem services. Why? Because there is a new investment by the federal government in trying to figure out how we value nature. And it turns out that satellites have a lot to do with that. That you are able to use satellites to come up with standard methodologies that may help us come up with new types of GDP equivalent metrics that can value nature in different ways. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff too, in addition to all of the, the bread and butter moon to Mars stuff.
So thinking about these roles, looking back a little over this history, what have been outcomes that you think are really important? Sort of a little bit of the greatest hits, the economic greatest hits of NASA.
So listening this week to all the panels, the thing that really struck me is that there was no way we would have had this type of meeting and this type of conversation 10 years ago. We just were not having. And what I think has happened is that we have had a culture change at NASA. And I believe as an economist that actually economics are actually downstream of culture. That how we engage with each other, how we transact business is actually more of a function of the culture that is established and the culture that exists than it is of dollars and cents. And I think the most important impact that we had with the Emerging Space Office, thanks in part to some of the reports that you and I and your team worked on together, was that we helped change the culture at NASA to one that was pro-engagement with commercial activities, pro-engagement with markets, and that was open to taking risk through innovative new solutions. And one of the examples that I point to is in the Emerging Space report that we worked on together. We had at the very bottom of the kind of first page, one line. This was released in 2014, and that line was that when NASA was formed, only a government program could go to the moon. That may not be true in the future. And that was a very controversial line. That report was one of the first times I almost got fired, but by far from the last.
Glad to help. Glad to help.
Yeah, always, Carissa. And we changed that culture. And so now what we have CLD. We have a completely different approach to how we're going to live in low Earth orbit in perpetuity than we had before. We have a mission at the agency that in addition to exploring the lunar surface, we understand that there's part of NASA's role to encourage commercial activity on the moon. That is a new thing. 10, 15 years ago, that was not really deeply understood as part of the agency's mission. So I think that culture change, thinking about NASA's role as a catalyst in the economic system, and that really we won't succeed in our goals if we don't have a robust economic system that explores the solar system in perpetuity. We can't have the accessibility of going to different planets, as part of a gap year 100 years in the future, if we don't have a robust economic system. Our ambitions as a community require there to be not just programs, but entire economies in space.
It's so interesting because, of course, there's been a long-standing conversation about commercial space in our community. The sophistication and the nuance, to me, is what's so profoundly different now. Talking about not just, oh, we support commercial, we're going to do some subsidies, or no, this is really something that the government needs to control, but living in that trade space of complexity and uncertainty, and I feel like there's almost a bit of an academic approach to that's been supportive, a data approach to that. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that conversation happens within NASA across centers at different levels around commercial capabilities and how they relate to what NASA's going to do?
So the most kind of common questions that program managers, who really are the kind of front lines of commercial activities, people who are responsible for the programs, they want to know, how much money has this company raised, right? And when we started this activity, there were easy ways to find out, right? We had to fund various studies that actually then became public resources, like the Startup Space Report. Now there's actually a huge number of resources out there that can tell you this kind of stuff. But then the questions are, well, what are the market segments, right? What different types of services can these companies serve, and how do they actually overlap or not with what NASA wants? Our communication services program is one that I'm supporting right now. That's a very interesting one, right? We're switching to a different model of buying commercial communication services in the future for human spaceflight vehicles. It's very different than having TDRS. Okay, but what is that market segment compared to the direct to internet, direct to home kind of satellite internet? Those are different, but a lot of the same companies are involved, and we have given out funded space act agreements to many of the same types of companies. So helping the different programs think through all those different variations of where they're likely to sell to, how important NASA is, and then frankly, what are some of the risks in the market, right? What's the likelihood of bankruptcy? These types of things.
NASA's corporate constituency is no longer just aerospace firms.
No, that's very true. And, I used to like to joke that, NASA has a GDP equivalent of Bosnia, Herzegovina, or Afghanistan. And sometimes we're run, sometimes better, sometimes, in that region. Which I don't really mean, of course, but the fact that it gets a laugh tells me that some people sympathize. The point there is that NASA is a full-on economy in itself. If NASA was a nation, it would actually be on the rank of other major countries. And so it is so diverse. You've got 10 centers across the country. You've got everything from aeronautics to earth science to JWST to human ambitions at the moon, all within one institution. And that is an entire economy, and it's a very unique one, actually.
One of the analogies I like to use to shine a light on that is, let's talk about the ocean economy, right? Do we mean snorkeling, or do we mean, oil drilling? There's so much breadth, and yet the fact that space is so diverse in one agency, it's extraordinary. And it's not just US focused, right? NASA has kind of been a catalyst for international activity around space, not just exploration, but also space from an economic development standpoint.
Absolutely. CubeSats, I still tend to advocate as one of the single most powerful tools of space access and space development around the world. If you look at the number of international companies that have arisen in the last 10 years, companies like Nano Avionics that are now a fully fledged company that's been acquired. How did they get their start? Well, 2 grad students came to NASA Ames and they heard about these CubeSat things. And they went back to Lithuania and they built the nation's first CubeSats. And that resulted in an entire company, right? That started an entire economic growth. And that's been happening all around the world, which is why we are really living in this kind of second space age, third space age, however you want to think about it. And it is global. And it's global in a very interesting way that I think we're going to still be kind of, working through for the next few decades.
So speaking of the next few decades, what economists love is being asked to predict the future. So I'm going to do that to you. Get out the crystal ball and talk to us about, the next decade and potentially beyond through the lens of economic leadership.
So, when you think about the major economic drivers for, human space exploration, you can also think about what's not really changing, what's similar to the past. We're obviously entering a period of non-trivial geopolitical competition in space, and it's going to shape our industry for quite some time. Cannot, overemphasize how significant that is going to be as a driver on our entire system. Civil, of course, national security, commerce as well. All of these things are going to be entwined, and they're all going to be entwined in particular in a completely new way at the moon. That is something that we have never really seen before. And I think we're just starting to think through what that means. In fact, the report that was released that Pavialal mentioned actually yesterday is a really good one, and I encourage people to read it. He talks about how we're going to have to think about operating on the moon from an operational perspective. How close do you think you're going to be getting to different entities? This is a really important challenge that we're working through. Everyone here in this room is part of the team that is going to have to think through how we do some of this stuff in the future and to maintain the moon and space in general for peaceful purposes. That's NASA's job. We are a peaceful scientific exploration agency. And that is going to become increasingly important, I believe, in the future because geopolitical competition is going to be driving things. And I hope geopolitical cooperation as well, because the International Space Station, which is one of my favorite programs that I've ever worked with, emerged out of a completely unprecedented act of geopolitical cooperation that shaped the world for the better in a really fundamental way. I think that's going to be a huge driver. I think the other major driver that I think we can't underestimate is that the intrinsic motivations of individuals will continue to shape this industry in ways that we cannot predict and cannot control.
That's code for a billionaire's going to do stuff.
Yeah, billionaire is going to billionaire. It is real. I mean, one of the changes that I think is important to get our heads around is that we had a model that space exploration happened because a government and a president and a Congress set an objective and then things flowed down through programs and engineering. In reality, from the start, space exploration happens because individuals, for whatever psychological reasons they have, want to do things in space. And if they have their own capital, they can go do it. And if they don't have their own capital, they find patrons and partnerships and exchanges to try and achieve those objectives. And now that space is more accessible, now that capital has a certain amount of fluidity around the world, that landscape is way better for any individual than at any time in space history. And then just the last major driver that I really think it is important to highlight is that climate change is going to be a major economic driver in so many different ways, including at NASA. A lot of people don't realize, but NASA really is on the front lines of climate change research. We employ more Earth scientists than any other part of the federal government. We provide a lot of the baseline data related to climate adaptability, including climate mitigation. The EMIT payload was just mentioned, which is starting to figure out how to quantify methane emissions from space. These are critically important types of information that we need for both climate adaptation and climate mitigation.
So I want to take a brief little detour because you mentioned ISS. And in addition to your day job as chief economist, you had an interesting role with ISS. I'm just curious about that. And I also would love to take a couple questions if we have a moment to do that. So let's talk about ISS a little bit. And then I have one other question, then we'll go to the audience.
Sounds good. Yeah, so while still serving in my chief economist role, I was asked to take on the role of the ISS program executive, so the ISS National Lab program executive, after a rather critical independent review team had come out with a report that had criticized kind of NASA and NCAS's management of the International Space Station National Lab. And it was, it was a very interesting role. But the reason that it was so important to the agency and remains so important is that the ISS is a microeconomy. It is actually this critical function that has allowed the catalyst for so many businesses, including a number of the ones that are now traded publicly on the stock markets, because it is the source of the in-space production applications that we see coming through. It is where, of course, all of our cargo vehicles and crew vehicles fly to. It is the core anchor of demand. And the National Lab is this really invaluable construct, and got to work with Marilyn Dittmar a little bit in that role. And I'm really happy to see that the National Lab is doing real well. It was a real critical period. There was a lot of leadership transition at the time. So, sometimes the chief economist gets to be a fixer too. It's kind of fun.
And then the final question that, not the final question, I have about 24 others, but we'll go to yours. The one that I'm going to be disciplined about and ask is, thinking about that future, thinking about those drivers, geopolitical interplay, lunar activity, climate, what kind of skills is NASA going to need? What new jobs might pop up that are maybe as surprising as chief economist was when it popped up?
Yeah, it's a great question. I tend to be an advocate actually for the sociologists. You have to look at human behavior through lenses other than prices and exchange. I think there's a lot of work actually for figuring out, public opinion, figuring out, demographics of who is able to access our services. Sociology is a really underappreciated one. I'm actually an advocate also for bringing back at some point the artist in residence program. There's only one of those every two, Lori Anderson, and I tend to like her work. But it was not something we were able to continue. But I think people are starting to see that the artistic and cultural narrative landscape shapes the space demand function. Actually, by creating art, people want more space. So I think art's a really important one. And then just thinking about kind of the types of jobs, NASA, one of the most interesting things I think to think about is whether NASA will still exist and what it will be doing in 200 years. I think it still will be, but we have the potential to be that type of long-lived institution. And I look forward to there being kind of an associate administrator for interstellar, the Interstellar Operations Mission Directorate, because when they get the reorg order, it'll have a light delay time of about 5 years or 20 years. So they'll have enough time to still run through everything they had, planned before they get the reorg order.
I totally support the artist in residence program. BryceTech is growing. We're still a little smaller than NASA, but we have an artist on staff who you know well and have worked with.
One of my favorites.
And it can be profound in its value in communicating, helping people understand, even shaping vision. So do we have questions from the audience?
You ran up to me and said, I have a question.
I do have a question.
Excellent.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you, as much as I think economic models are very interesting and I'm appreciative of the impact, do you have something like a system dynamics model that you are using to look at the reinforcing loops in the economy? And is that something that's available for us to take a look at? Thank you.
Yes. The answer sadly is no. We wish we did. The great thing about economics, and it's kind of similar to biology, is that in economics, human decision-making has an independent vote that does not make it mechanistic models that are highly predictable. There's huge amounts of stochasticity, huge amounts of nonlinearity in human behavior, which is why you're able to see these massive market shifts. And that's really hard. I mean, in some respects, we are still, I think, in the very early days of economic kind of work. And I tend to think kind of like Paul Krugman often says that, the real idealistic, space economist is Harry Seldon from the Foundation series, where you've got so much data point from an entire galaxy that you're able to predict human behavior. But currently, we are still trying to figure out humans. They're really curious beings.
I think what Alex is saying is he could do that model if only the sociologists would do it.
Well, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, Harry Seldon actually is better thought of as a really good sociologist. I think that's a great point.
Do you have another question? Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Alex, question on the economic impact report. I'm just curious if anything in there sort of surprised you positively or negatively about it, because looking at the top line numbers, sort of what you would expect from the sort of that output from the input that NASA provides.
Thanks, Jeff. That's a really appreciated question. The one that actually I thought was really great news that everyone here in particular should know is that we did our last economic impact in 2019. And since that time, the estimated economic impact of our moon to Mars activities in particular grew by over 40%. And that is what you'd expect with the amount of extra dollars that have been flowing into moon to Mars activities, but this shows it. And it shows exactly where in the country those dollars have been flowing and the impact it has had. Unsurprisingly, one of the most impacted states for moon to Mars activities, Alabama. So I would just encourage everyone to look at that map, but I would say that for me, seeing a 40% increase, I was not sure I was even aware that we were increasing our investment in moon to Mars activities that much over the last 2 years, but we were. And that really shows that for me is what the economic definition of we are going looks like.
Terrific. And one more question from
Okay.
an AAS fellow
question. I'm in trouble.
Okay, Alex. So we're seeing NASA shift a little bit in being responsible for large development programs to actually purchasing services and things, but there's a huge amount of human capability and actually other capabilities that are resident within NASA. How do those centers start working as partners, and where NASA is not giving the money, so they're working together, they're actually working together to produce a purpose? What is the way academic and industry and other interested parties can work with NASA to facilitate that transfer?
Yeah, it seems to me that you're pulling on this question of kind of also how does NASA maintain the skill set and the workforce related specifically to human spaceflight as we transition to a much more diverse ecosystem where a lot of other entities are operating human spaceflight vehicles as well, right? I think there's a lot of ways in which people can work with and engage with NASA from academia. There's contracts, there's grants, there's internships, et cetera. There's reimbursable Space Act agreements, right? A lot of companies come to NASA and they get reimbursable Space Act agreements to get NASA knowledge transferred over. But I also believe that it's going to be critical for NASA to maintain some types of operational roles for human spaceflight vehicles. Gateway is the obvious one that we are doing that with currently, right? But I think it's really critical to think about how the agency maintains that skill set over the next 50 years, 100 years, because NASA still is this draw. We want the best in the world of our human spaceflight engineers to come to NASA and to all of the companies that are operating other human spaceflight vehicles, right? We want there to be a growth overall, not just of the workforce for human spaceflight, but to have a multiplicity of human spaceflight cultures. For me, that's one of the most important things, that we used to have a singular human spaceflight culture, right? It was located primarily at Johnson, distributed to some of the other centers and through industry. But now there are literally independent human spaceflight cultures, and that is robustness. And how it all works at the center level is your classic, classic business 101 kind of microeconomics. Some competition, some cooperation, some challenges. And I think you got to go to every center. Each of them have their own lessons learned. I actually think the centers themselves, the stories of how the centers have led transformations, which are different at KSC than they are at Ames and they are at Johnson. We need to be listening to more of those stories too.
Thank you so much. I think we have a question here.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you guys for doing this. It's been awesome. First off, when you talk about economic impact, Alex, I suspect that if you look internationally too, there's significant. So if you're touting the benefits of NASA from an economic standpoint, I think it spans the globe, not just the United States. But my question was this. So within NASA, a lot of new programs come out and they say, hey, this is going to be a commercial program where we're encouraging commerciality, and NASA asks for business plans. Now, I know previous program managers have sought your help in evaluating what a business plan and the validity and the strength of a given business plan, because that's not typical skill that's grown inside of NASA. So I'm curious, how is that going? And are you helping grow that capability within NASA?
We've actually, over the last few years, we've kind of hired some new folks in. They don't, all sit on the 9th floor. They often sit in the programs. They sit in CFO's office. The SID group actually is one of the other unsung heroes of NASA headquarters bureaucrats. They do a great job of providing some of this type of data and people who do that. It's a tough one. We also at times have actually hired in people. A lot of people know the story of Alan Marty, who actually came into NASA from venture capital to serve and be able to do some of that work for COTS. Some of the challenges is, though, that he fully left venture capital at that time. And to maintain some of the ethics kind of restrictions, can't have someone who's both dipping into the market and also providing their advice to NASA. So there's some challenges around it that are really kind of fundamental in that way. But we do need more. We need more people inside the agency who have entrepreneurial and financial bents. And the challenge right now, to be honest, and it's a challenge that folks actually mentioned on some of the panels, is keeping talent is actually harder than you think. If you've got good financial due diligence capabilities, there are so many opportunities in venture capital right now. When I started, it was really rare to have, kind of a space economics job at all, right? Now it actually isn't. There's a number of space economists in private industry. There are a number of space economists in academia, and there's a lot in the investment sector because space has been one of the fastest growing sectors of the economy over the last few years.
Please, and then one final
Hi, Alex.
question.
All my favorite people.
So the question for me is, you were talking about how we capture these things in the value inherently within the different programs we have, Moon to Mars, et cetera. But we also have a lot of really cross-cutting technology and capabilities. You got autonomy and robotics, high performance spaceflight computing, and numerous, right, EDL technologies. So when you're calculating that value and you're looking across the programs, how do we best communicate that cross-cutting aspect?
Oh, that's a great question. So it is a communication, it's a narrative thing, right? The model just tells you this basic output, right? But the real story is how, when we invest in our plant growth at KSC, an entire vertical farming industry emerges, a short 10 years later. But that's how it works, right? We lay those basic foundations, and the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium is one of them, right? That is a program effort that is laying the first investments in things that will become the industries of lunar power and lunar resources in the future. And so it's being able to tell that narrative of where we're going, right? And recognizing that we in the federal government have this basic R&D function and responsibility, right? That's why we exist to do some of that early market investment.
And if I could kind of link that back to the role of the chief economist. So this question of how does the value of knowledge that NASA creates get calculated, get characterized, get captured? And there have been a whole bunch of partial efforts, tracking spin-offs, periodic studies and reports. But to me, and I've spent much of my career on those kinds of challenges, to me, having an office of the chief economist who's got a frame of reference that's not today and tomorrow and yesterday, but long-term, really enhances the likelihood of following and tracking that meandering path from R&D to industry across a whole range of domains.
Nope, thank you. Yeah, I agree. And, looking out here, a lot of students, I'm getting old. We're going to need a new chief economist at some point. So now is a wonderful time to be digging into this area. There's never been a better time to be studying this stuff.
One more, I've been assured it'll be very quick.
Depending on who you talk to, the United States is already in a housing recession, and IMF has warned that there's a global recession on the horizon. Interest rates are going up. With that usually means capital funding gets tighter. What advice would you have for entrepreneurs or finance-minded individuals that want to bring more capital to the space industry, whether it be in partnership with NASA or for commercial purposes? How can we bring more money into this industry? And there's a Chase Econometrics report in 1976. For every dollar spent on Apollo, there was 14 generated into the economy.
Sure.
If we are going into recession, with your crystal ball, Alex, is NASA going to get a budget increase for Artemis? That's expensive. And if not, how can private industry help bring some of that capital to the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. That one needs a whole other 40 minutes. My quick answer is when you look at the history of space exploration and the funding of it, including through the 19th century, you have a high amount of stochasticity. You have these huge peaks. There's a peak in the 1840s with a huge observatory building boom then it goes into a trough. And there's a peak again with the Lick Observatory in the 1870s, goes into a trough. There's a peak again in the 1920s with the Palomar and the Mount Wilson observatories. And then if you take that into human spaceflight, there's a peak in the 1960s, and then there's a trough. And there has been a peak, thanks, we now know, to Chris's team's analysis in the venture capital world. There's been a peak over the last few years. My advice is simply, this is a very, very long run game. One of the great honors that we have is that we are in a community that gets to play a multi-centuries long game related to humanity in the cosmos. So patience, capital markets will come and capital markets will go. Play for the long run and keep your eye on that long run objective. Alex, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And we know you have planes to go to.